Sure. Designing good policies for societal issues comes from good data and good research, just like it does in the lab. So in the case of overpriced drugs, you want to know exactly where are the bottlenecks, who is suffering, which drugs are the most expensive, and you also need some creativity and foresight. What would a critic say about this policy, and how can I get ahead of that?
Welcome to the official podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. In this podcast, students and early career researchers share more about their publication in the journal. Join us weekly to hear from the next generation of STEM leaders as we elevate their voices in science, technology, and innovation policy. So welcome. Thank you for joining us for this episode of SciPol SoundBites, a podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. I'm Adriana Bankston, JSPG's Chief Outreach Officer and your host for this podcast. Today, we continue with episodes from the joint issue between JSPG and the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowships Program. Authors we're interviewing today are discussing important topics around healthcare, regulation of drug pricing, pharmaceuticals, and the connection to patients. So let's talk a little bit about each publication. So we'll start with Saishree Badrinarayanan. She's a PhD candidate in the integrated program Neuroscience at McGill. She holds a Master's of Science from the University of Edinburgh in integrated neuroscience. Her research focuses on circuits responsible for spatial navigation and memory in mice. And she's currently the president of the Montreal-based student-led nonprofit Science and Policy Exchange. The publication in JSPG by Saishree and her co-authors is entitled Artificial Intelligence Alongside Physicians in Canada, Reality and Risks. So Saishree, this is a very important topic. It seems very complex and maybe difficult to address in terms of linking AI to medicine. So I'm curious how your group has approached this topic and some of the solutions that you propose.
Thanks, Adriana, for having us part of the podcast today. And as you mentioned, it is a really big topic that we've tried to unpack in our policy memo. So just some of the few things that we tried to address, I'll talk about. So in the memo, as mentioned, we seek to address some of the concerns associated with incorporating the use of AI in healthcare. And more often than not, these are usually around issues concerning black box algorithms and privacy regulations. I do want to state that this memo, as titled, is specific to the context of Canada. So there might be some rules or regulations that may not transfer on to other countries. So before we begin, just a general a sort of introduction is that black box algorithms, for those who don't know, are a method or function for machine learning systems, where the inputs, output, and machinery of operation is usually hidden or unknown to the user and to the consumer at the end. So what this does is that it basically takes in large data sets, and people then train the machine learning systems on these data sets to generate different kind of results. So this is particularly harmful as ML systems construct their decision making, as mentioned, from these data sets and can inherit existing biases and prejudices from the data it is trained on. And this can become inefficient or problematic when you especially employ it in the healthcare setup. So to address this main issue, we ask that the Government of Canada enforce regulations that are already laid out actually in the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat's Directive. And basically in this directive, what they want to do is they're asking private and commercial companies to develop processes that test for the unintended data biases and other factors that may unfairly impact the outcomes before it is deployed in the healthcare setup. And they also ask for the completion of an algorithmic impact assessment prior to and after deployment of any automated decision system. So while it's hard to move away from using black box algorithms, because this is also the fundamental ways in which machine learning systems and AI is used, what we are trying to do is hold these companies accountable for using these systems such that should something happen untoward, then we have a pipeline for where this issue might have risen from. So while that concerns black box algorithms, the second one, like I mentioned, is privacy regulations. So we touch upon the lack of harmony between different provinces on privacy regulations in Canada. So while Canada does have a federal framework that provides direction on data privacy and protection for electronic communication and personal information, not all provinces within Canada are required to follow this directive if their provincial laws are similar to the federal framework. So what happens is that because of this, some provinces have stricter laws concerning data privacy compared to others, which makes it harder to transfer hospital information and patient records, which is key to enabling interoperability between healthcare delivery points across the country. And what this could also mean in general is that if you were, transferring patient information from a province that had a stricter regulation to a province that didn't have, then you might lose out on data, or you might lose on the protection during the transfer of information, which is vital, when you think about having digital interoperability becoming the next healthcare delivery point. So what we ask in our policy memo is that you establish mandatory amendments to provincial laws with respect to healthcare to minimally uphold the privacy standards of the General Data Protection Regulatory Framework. Now, the GDPR is a widely used framework across the European Union and has been tested and implemented in the province of Quebec already. So by having other provinces also incorporate this, it can help in increasing the transfer of hospital information, patient records, while also safeguarding the privacy of the patient. So these are the general points that our policy memo tries to touch upon through providing various recommendations.
Great, thank you for that very thorough answer. I think it's a really important point to bring up about data and how that can inform healthcare and what you're working on. I think one of the things that, it's interesting that you mentioned data bias. So this is one of the things that I've heard about more recently is that there's a lot of bias within AI and this field specifically. I'm curious if you have a comment about how this impacts underrepresented minorities or different groups differently, because it seems like there are a lot of factors that come into play here. Who has access to these technologies? How do you use, because obviously we're kind of going into the technology side of things here. Are there disparities in healthcare that can arise from some of this?
Yes, absolutely. So this is definitely where we saw this major issue and then thought about addressing the Blackbox algorithm thing. So there are many examples, not just within Canada, but across, as you mentioned, different places that are trying to incorporate AI, showing that AI systems are show biases towards underrepresented minorities, and this is a very growing concern. And thinking about healthcare and how doctors use this information to then come up with a patient information plan, it has a lot of unintended consequences. So the one thing that we do recommend, and this is something that we also noticed that the federal government is now also trying to do and recognizes, is that when you train these algorithmic systems, which is what we also recommend, is that they use the sample data that truly represents the population where that particular hospital is located from. So not train the AI system that's going to be deployed in a hospital, say in one province, using data from a completely different province, which will have a very different population. So we ask that to try to minimize these efforts. These could be some ways in which that can be done.
Great, very helpful. Thanks for that answer. So we'll move on to Amanda. So Amanda Hurley received her PhD in molecular biology from Princeton in 2017, and she's currently a postdoc with Joe Hendelman at University of Wisconsin-Madison. She also serves as the Professional Development Chair for Catalyst for Science Policy. She is a former eLife ambassador and sits on the board for the nonprofit Future of Research. And the publication that Amanda and her co-authors published in JSPG is entitled Federal Policy for Lowering Prescription Drug Prices. So talking a little more about healthcare, we've heard a lot about drug prices recently. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little more about your memo and how your recommendations are looking to address drug prices.
Sure, and I'll first say thank you so much for inviting us here today. This is a really cool opportunity to take our memo another step further. So yes, drug prices are skyrocketing right now, and it's costing American lives. People are dying because they can't afford insulin, a drug we've known about for decades. So first, we need to allow the Health and Human Services Secretary to negotiate Medicare drug prices. Medicare pays 73 to 80% more for the same drugs compared to Medicaid and the VA, and this costs the federal government billions. So some legislation has been proposed linking the price to an international median for the drug price in other developed countries like Canada and the UK and Germany. However, this has been accused as price fixing by economic conservatives and the pharmaceutical lobby, and it could actually lead to drug shortages. Additionally, the penalty for not setting those prices would be a tax, in which the response of the drug companies could be just hiking prices even higher to make up for the lost revenue. So what we really need is more equal opportunities for market competition. So what will the incentive be to negotiate with the HHS secretary? Non-compliant companies will lose compound-specific patent exemptions, which will open the door for generics to compete and drive those prices down.
Great, very concise, thank you. So it seems like you're advocating for changes in legislation, which is certainly one way to address this. Can you talk a little more about what specifics or who do you think are the stakeholders that can play a role here?
Yes, you mentioned legislation, so Congress is the major stakeholder in this case. There have been attempts at executive action from the executive branch, but that's complicated because it's not allowed to contradict current law. So implementation through executive order is difficult and would come up against a lot of barriers. So really, Congress is the way to enact our memo recommendations. And the FDA itself actually might be able to interpret its laws a little uniquely. So the FDA is another huge stakeholder in bringing down drug prices and bringing new drugs to market.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on to Cavi. Kavitha Chintam is a PhD student in chemical engineering at Northwestern. She investigates the fundamental mechanisms behind electrochemical carbon dioxide reduction. She is also the Legislative Outreach Chair for the Science Policy Outreach Task Force at Northwestern. And as an advocate for environmental justice, she is interested in at the intersection between science policy and the public to aid our most vulnerable communities. And her publication, together with colleagues in JSPG, is entitled Overview of Pharmaceutical Disposable Methods, addressed to the General Assembly of Illinois. So continuing with pharmaceuticals, can you tell us a little more about your work and your memo on this topic?
Absolutely. And first of all, I'd also like to thank you for having us all here today to discuss these important topics. Pharmaceutical disposal is really an intersectional topic between public health concerns and environmental concerns. Flushing, for example, is good because it reduces the risk of overdose. So several drugs such as opioids that have fentanyl and oxycodone are on the FDA flush list because the risk to children is higher than the risk of environmental damage. However, there is also the risk of high contamination in water supply. So this is another consideration we took in our memo. There are also several take-back programs that exist throughout the country where if you have medicine that you haven't used, you can take it back. However, the issue with all of these initiatives is that there isn't much advertisement or there's not really a baseline in the US to how to properly dispose of pharmaceuticals. And the public, when you get your medication, don't necessarily know how to best dispose of them. There's also an interesting question here of equitable access to pharmaceuticals. So one way that this can tie into that is to introduce the selling back of prescriptions that are returned to people who can't otherwise afford those medications. For example, there's a program in Tulsa County, Oklahoma, where they work with a senior home, an elderly home for low income, particularly citizens, and they can provide prescriptions that have been returned free of charge. So there's really an opportunity here to not only safely discard of pharmaceuticals, but also give back to communities in a positive way. So our memo in particular proposes educating the public, because that is often the most important thing in this kind of program, is that if you don't have the public and the community aware of what's going on, then it won't be effective. And secondly, we also advocate for enacting laws for the donation and reuse of medication. So again, this kind of closed loop cycle where there's proper disposal, there's proper bringing back of this medication to pharmacies or to drop-off sites, and then recirculating back into the community to low-income people. So again, this topic is really important because it intersects environmental issues and public health concerns, and can also provide more equitable access to medication for everyone.
Great, very helpful, thanks. So I can see a lot of common themes here. But since you're focusing on Illinois, I want to ask you a question of, how do you see this implemented at the state level, and who would be addressing these issues in Illinois?
Yeah, so this would really be an effort of the state providing funding for communities to use, because obviously each community would have to approach this issue in different ways. Different community centers could be responsible for picking up or being donation drop-off areas, things like that. What really needs to happen is the state should provide the funding and provide a kind of baseline information for how communities can respond to these issues. And then communities can go back and use those funds in equitable and successful, hopefully, ways. So the most important thing, like I said, is education and providing communities, low income, high income, whatever, with the same information is the key issue here.
Great, yeah, that makes sense, thank you. So last but not least, Griffin McCutcheon. He is a PhD student in the Center for Molecular Design and Biomimetics at ASU. He's studying the design and implementation of genetic logic circuits in bacterial and mammalian cells. And he's also the co-chair of the Arizona Science Policy Network, where he helps organize and educate fellow graduate students on policy actions, such as contacting state representatives, writing articles for local and national publications, and hosting town halls. The publication in JSPG by Griffin and co-authors is entitled "Stem the Tide of Predatory Stem Cell Clinics, State and FDA Coordination to Protect Patients." So we're kind of coming back to more drug regulation here with the FDA. I really like your focus on patients as well. So tell us more about your publication.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, thank you for having us. It's fun to talk about all this stuff. Generally speaking, our policy memo is not so much one of new regulation, so much as one of how do you implement laws that already exist. And in this case, the laws are focused on, well, stem cells, obviously, but more generally, con men who are selling drugs that don't do what they say they do. A big problem here in Arizona and also in my home state of Florida is we have lots of stem cell clinics. And these clinics, some of them test drugs that are actually in clinical trials, that are overseen by the FDA and have a lot of patient protections and oversight. But a lot of them are also just pretty much putting up online ads or ads on Facebook saying, get injected with stem cells and we'll cure blindness or Parkinson's or whatever neurodegenerative disease you have. And they're modern day snake oil salesmen. So what we in our memo are doing is we're kind of laying out a framework by which the state and federal government can coordinate to enforce the laws that are already there. We want to have happen is we want to have the FDA receive funding that it can then allocate to states to better incentivize them to sort of track down these stem cell clinics that are frankly abusing patients because they're appealing to people with chronic illnesses, the elderly, people who just don't know enough information to know that these are scams. And in doing so, they're wreaking both financial havoc on the patients who they're scamming, but occasionally also causing massive physical harm. Such as people have gone blind because they've gotten stem cells injected into their eyes that haven't been properly, if there is such a thing as properly treated for that kind of injection for an unregulated medicine. And what we want to see is sort of a coordination between the states and the FDA, where the states actually provide new legislation that helps to really put the ball in the states' court so that they can enforce the federal laws that the FDA actually oversees. So we're kind of, and this is thankfully already happening to some degree in Florida, and their first start towards this is what's led us to build some of our framework.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so again, there's a lot of common themes as I was thinking about the FDA. So I want to ask you about, can you comment on how this is currently being regulated by the FDA? And I'm also curious about your patient population. Can you comment on that, what that looks like in your work?
Sure, yeah, the current FDA regulation is, most of it's been settled by courts, as it were. There was a long sort of loophole that a lot of these clinics were trying to work around, where they would say, well, we're not distributing medicine, we're doing a surgical procedure, because all we're doing is we're taking blood from patients, spinning it down, enhancing the existing stem cells in your blood, rejuvenating them, and injecting them back in. And that's a surgical procedure, so the FDA can, I don't know, kick dirt. But thankfully, the courts have overturned that, saying, no, what you're doing is you're manipulating these cells and you're advertising it as a drug. This very clearly falls under the FDA's jurisdiction. So a lot of the FDA regulation around that has been kind of making it, getting the courts to agree that this is illegal in the first place and that they have the jurisdiction. And so now it's a matter of enforcement, because we kind of have this mix of the scamming clinics, as it were, and then just clinics that aren't doing best practices. And what our memo focuses mainly on is the scammers. And as for patient population, it's typically people who medicine has, I don't want to say failed, but the chronically ill, the people who there don't exist current medical treatments in some cases to treat what they have. I mean, some of the diseases I listed, like Parkinson's and blindness, those are very tricky, hard to fix conditions. So these are typically people who are desperate, and they are, they're looking for anything that could possibly help, and that's part of what makes this a very sad issue.
Yeah, thank you. That's really important work. I'm glad you're addressing that, and it's interesting to hear the methods that you have. I think while you were talking about, when you're talking about the stem cells as, it's going to cure blindness. So since we're all, scientists here, I think one question that's coming out of all of your work is, how can we advocate for early career scientists who are coming into the system, and this whole idea of using science to inform public policy in a way that is evidence-based, but clearly not something that, you just read on the news and believe everything. So how do we educate the next generation to use their scientific knowledge for policy, and even the public too, and not, believe sort of everything that's in the media? I don't know, Griffin, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think this is kind of what we try to do at the organization I'm part of and I co-chair. We try to help other graduate students understand how to get involved. Like, what does it look like? How do you begin? And a lot of it is just knowing that you're smart, that people care what you have to say. I think that's kind of the first step for us usually, is convincing people that, you've been studying science for almost a decade in some cases. You're an expert. People care what you think. And you can, a lot of local state representatives, if they have an interest in science, or even if they don't, they just need someone smart to talk to. So sometimes the first step is just cold calling someone and saying, hey, I'm here if you want to ask about this. Or, just if you have an opinion on something, taking the time to write it out and send it off to a publication like the Journal of Science, Policy and Governance, or Nature, or any of those other ones. There aren't really restrictions on who you can email and put your op-ed somewhere. And that's, for me, that was kind of an enlightening experience when one of the founder of organizations said, oh, this little whatever memo op-ed thing you've written, I'll just email Nature and see what they think about it. I'm like, you can do that? They just take people off the street like that? That's allowed? So at least like for general involvement, that's been a big thing for us is, I don't want to say boosting egos, but yeah, like making people realize that, hey, you're experts. Tell people about it.
Yeah, I think that's really important because a lot of times students don't think they have the expertise or, and I also work in policy now, so I know that it's, they rely on constituent information a lot, and grad students and postdocs can do that for sure. Does anybody else want to comment on this question? You can have one more.
I can talk about that a little bit. In terms of early career scientists, I think one thing I've realized being in academia the last 2 years as a PhD student is there's often a real disconnect between STEM and humanities and the public. A lot of times we're caught up in the fundamentals of the work we do and just like the data. But at the end of the day, no matter how fundamental the work we do, it's going to eventually affect a human and yourself and your family and your community, whatever. So I think that really needs to be on the forefront of early career scientists, rather than just thinking about how to do the best science. It's how to do the most equitable, most inclusive, the most fair, I guess, science. And the other part of that is data doesn't lie, but it's important to understand where data is coming from. And I think that's the real disconnect with some of the public, is that you can find evidence for anything pretty much, but where is it coming from? Is it reproducible? Are there other experts backing up what's being said? So I think that's something that also needs to be done. I think we as scientists understand that, but this needs to be communicated to the public more. So as scientists, especially early career, it's our opportunity and our privilege, honestly, to display our data in ways that the public can understand, and also to be very cognizant of the fact that our data does have an impact on people, even if it seems super removed from the public as it is.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think one really sort of related question is for, early career people who want to engage in policy, what does that look like to actually craft a good policy that is evidence-based, reflects the population that it's meant to, and I'm gonna maybe ask Amanda to comment on this. How do you craft a good policy?
Sure. Designing good policies for societal issues comes from good data and good research, just like it does in the lab. So in the case of overpriced drugs, you want to know exactly where are the bottlenecks, who is suffering, which drugs are the most expensive, and you also need some creativity and foresight. What would a critic say about this policy, and how can I get ahead of that? And so that would be my recommendation.
Great. And then Saishree, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I just want to say that I agree with the points raised by Griffin, Cavi, and Amanda, and I think it's absolutely essential also for us to realize that thinking about public policy and science policy is also a form of science communication. And, once I think early career researchers recognize that, then it might be easier for more trainees and other scientists to also get involved in this form of science communication. In that aspect, I think all of us would also say, agree with this, is that, finding a local chapter of a science policy group and getting involved with them is also a very great way for you to get your feet in the water, to actually test and see, what does it actually mean to be with a bunch of science policy nerds and enthusiasts and try to do something. And then to answer the question regarding the policy memo, I also agree with what Amanda said, and one of the essential things that we are trained on throughout a graduate career in science is to be critical thinkers, and that's exactly what a good policy memo, in all the ones that I've read, always have that component of it, is not just looking at the intended consequences, but what are the unintended consequences of this particular recommendation that you're outlining, and because this is a really nice line that I heard that, there is no good policy and bad implementation. Like, a good policy also involves the implementation. So you can't have them as two separate things. So thinking about a policy always, you have to think about how it's going to be implemented.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, really, really good, good insights there. So we have time for, I think, one last question, but I want to kind of ask this question about what has your experience been with publishing in JSPG, and kind of tie that to any final last words, things you want to say to the ECRs who are listening.
I can go ahead if that, yeah. So it was a really nice experience to go through the review process with JSPJ. Like, we had very nice reviewing editors and reviewers too, and it was more of a conversation to try to actually understand what our point was and how to convey it effectively. And I think this whole exercise, from finding the problem to writing a memo and also learning how to write one, has been really, I think once you know how to think in a particular way, you can't look at things in a way, like, you start thinking of things in the same way, like, what are the options, what are the recommendations, and so I think it was definitely a very enjoyable experience for me, and I'm sure like everyone else part of my group too. I would highly recommend people to try their hand at it. I think, so we wrote to JSPJ through the NSPN Policy Memo Competition. And I think, not thinking about the prize, but doing it for the experience is highly recommended.
Great. Griffin?
Yeah, we also applied, aiming for the competition, and we didn't get that. But yeah, it was very encouraging from JSPG to, like, hey, you didn't make it, but we like your stuff. Send it back in. So yeah, JSPG is very encouraging. Great working with the editorial team. I think Lee and Olivia, fantastic. And yeah, I mean, I highly encourage anyone who's listening, if you've got a thought on something, if you've got your hot takes, like, and want to make them into policy. Mine was just, I hate and obsessed with con artists, and these are the ones who are really a real pain in the ass here. So I started writing about those, and got other people in my group interested in them. I will say one of the cons to it, though, is that you'll start becoming very annoyed with tech evangelists and futurists. I don't know about all of you, but I can't listen to them anymore.
All right, good to know. Thanks. Amanda?
Yeah, JSPG is such an incredible opportunity for early career researchers to broaden the things that they're studying and the things that they're interested in, because, surprise, I am not a health policy analyst. I study bacteria, but this was a really immersive experience to sort of consume an entire field quickly and come up with some unique policies, taking in the body of work that has already been done. It was so cool. And I learned a lot through the editorial process as well. And I feel that was sort of the confidence issue that Griffin was mentioning earlier. We can do things outside of our wheelhouse, and it actually just expands our skill set. So I highly recommend it to anyone to try it with any topic they find interesting or bothersome. You can do it. So that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you. And Cavi, go ahead.
Yeah, working with JSPG was great. It really is a unique journal in that you're working really with the editors to craft your idea. And our memo was born out of a legislator concern in Illinois. So it was a unique way to approach the topic, in that we kind of saw these issues in Illinois as we were researching for this one pager for a legislator. And we were like, why don't we turn this into a memo for JSPG? And it was really helpful to have people actively helping us and not looking to, not publish us, which I think is a danger in some scientific journals. So yeah, I think I agree with what Amanda just said, which don't be afraid to go out of your comfort zone. I study climate change related things, and I wrote about pharmaceutical disposal, and I feel like it really helped me improve my science communication and make me more confident in talking about science that's not my own. But as a scientist, I feel privileged to be able to talk about other science if I do the research, obviously. And yeah, I think that's useful. I'm working on a couple of other memos right now, hoping to submit to JSPG, and because of the great first experience I had. So I definitely recommend it. It doesn't hurt to apply, it doesn't hurt to try. And even just the process of writing the memo yourself, even if it doesn't get published, I think is super valuable.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody. That's nice feedback to hear. And hopefully this podcast gives you a little bit more opportunity to talk about these things, and we'll be able to disseminate it widely. So really happy to be able to do that for you all. So to wrap up then, thank you everybody for joining us. You can find this episode and others like it on JSPG's YouTube channel and on SoundCloud. And that's it for this week on SciPol SoundBites, the podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal.